Hello and welcome to Stories Before Sleep. The night has settled in and the world feels a little quieter than usual. As you sink into that stillness, let me bring you a story about a man named Sisyphus. Now you might think you know who he is, some poor guy condemned to push a boulder up a hill for eternity. A cautionary tale about hubris. A punishment story. But that's not really what his story is about. His story is about something much deeper. It's about what happens when life strips everything away from you. When your cleverness can't save you. When your strength doesn't matter. When you're left with nothing but repetition, day after day, with no end in sight. And somehow, impossibly, he found something there. Something that changed everything. I think you need to hear this tonight because somewhere in your own life, you're probably pushing your own boulder. Maybe it's work that feels endless. Maybe it's responsibilities that never quite finish. Maybe it's the simple weight of getting through each day, and you're wondering if it all means anything at all. Sisyphus wondered the same thing, and what he discovered might surprise you. It might even comfort you as you drift towards sleep. So let me take you back to ancient Greece, back to the underworld, back to a man on a hillside learning something that the gods never intended him to learn. To understand Sisyphus, you need to step into the world that created him. Imagine the Mediterranean around 2,500 years ago. The Greeks didn't have the kind of organized religion we might think of today. They didn't have churches or formal doctrine. Instead, they had stories, myths, tales passed down through generations that tried to answer the biggest questions humans could ask. Why do we suffer? What happens when we die? How should we live? The ancient Greeks lived in city-states scattered across the Mediterranean. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and dozens of others. These weren't unified nations the way we think of countries today. They were independent communities, often competing with each other, sometimes at war. Life in these places could be brutal. Disease struck without warning. Wars claimed young men. Crops failed. The sea that provided food could also drown you in a moment. In the face of all this uncertainty, the Greeks turned to their gods and their myths. But here's the thing that makes Greek mythology different from many other religious traditions. The Greeks didn't believe their gods were entirely good or entirely just. Their gods were powerful, yes, but also petty, vengeful, jealous, and flawed. They made mistakes. They held grudges. They punished humans for minor infractions. In other words, the gods reflected human nature, itself just amplified to cosmic proportions. This matters because it shaped how Greeks understood their own lives. They believed in fate. The concept of Moira destiny ran through their entire worldview. You couldn't escape your fate. Even if you knew what it was, even if you tried to avoid it, it would find you anyway. The gods had woven your destiny into the fabric of existence before you were even born. This wasn't a comforting belief. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. Terrifying because it meant you couldn't control your own future. Liberating because it meant you weren't responsible for everything that happened to you. If the gods had decided your fate, then you could only do your best within the constraints given to you. You could act with honor. You could face your destiny with courage. But you couldn't change it. Picture a Greek gathering in the evening, maybe in Athens in the agora, the marketplace, or in a smaller town around a fire. People would gather to hear rhapsodes, professional storytellers who had memorized the great epics, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the works of Hesiod. Later, the dramatic plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides would be performed at festivals. Thousands of people would sit in outdoor amphitheaters, watching actors perform these myths on stage. These weren't just entertainment, though they certainly provided that. They were how Greeks processed their world. When they watched a character on stage struggle against fate, they were watching a reflection of their own struggles. When a hero faced impossible odds, the audience recognized their own impossible odds. When someone suffered consequences for their actions, the audience understood something about justice, about cause and effect, about the way the universe actually worked. The myths served another purpose too. They preserved cultural values. They taught young people how to behave, what to aspire toward, what to avoid. A young man might hear the story of Icarus flying too close to the sun and understand the danger of hubris, excessive pride. He might hear about Prometheus stealing fire for humanity and learn about sacrifice and defiance. He might hear about Heracles completing his 12 labors and understand that perseverance could overcome almost anything. But the myths also grappled with uncomfortable truths. They didn't shy away from showing that life could be fundamentally unfair, that good people suffered, that the innocent paid for the crimes of others, that sometimes there was no happy ending, that sometimes you could do everything right and still lose. This honesty about human suffering gave the myths their power. They didn't offer false comfort. They offered recognition. They said, yes, this is hard. Yes, this is unfair. Yes, people suffer. And here's how some people face that reality. The concept of fate in Greek culture wasn't passive, though. It wasn't about sitting around waiting for destiny to happen. Instead, it created a kind of tension. You couldn't change your ultimate fate, but you could choose how to meet it. You could face it with courage or cowardice, with honor or shame, with dignity or desperation. That choice, how you responded to what life gave you, that was the only real freedom you had. This is crucial to understanding Sisyphus. When he's condemned to push a boulder up a hill for eternity, he can't change that punishment. That's his fate. But what he can change is how he experiences it. What he can change is whether he meets it with despair or with something else entirely. The Greeks understood this distinction intimately. They lived with it every day. So when you hear the story of Sisyphus, remember that you're hearing it the way ancient Greeks would have heard it. Not as a simple punishment story, not as a cautionary tale about being too clever, but as a profound meditation on how to live when life seems meaningless, how to find purpose when purpose isn't handed to you, how to create meaning in a universe that doesn't guarantee any. That's what made these stories survive for thousands of years. That's why we're still telling them tonight. Before Sisyphus became the man pushing a boulder through eternity, he lived. He ruled. He built a kingdom and made decisions that rippled across the ancient world. Understanding who he actually was makes his story matter in a way that a simple punishment narrative never could. Sisyphus ruled Corinth, a city-state that occupied a crucial position in ancient Greece. Corinth controlled the narrow strip of land connecting the Peloponnese to the rest of Greece. This geography made it powerful. Trade routes flowed through Corinth. Ships from across the Mediterranean stopped at its ports. Wealth accumulated there. A clever ruler could leverage this position into tremendous influence, and Sisyphus understood this completely. The ancient sources describe him as exceptionally intelligent, not just smart in an abstract way, but practically clever. He could read people. He understood how power actually worked, not how it theoretically should work. He grasped that laws and rules bent for those with enough cunning and resources. He recognized that the world rewarded those willing to operate in the gray spaces between what was permitted and what was forbidden. Sisyphus built Corinth into a thriving city. He expanded its trade networks. He strengthened its walls. He made shrewd alliances with neighboring cities. Other rulers respected him, though perhaps not always warmly. There's something about a person who's too clever, too successful, too confident in their own abilities. It makes others uncomfortable. It creates a kind of tension in relationships. People wondered what he might do next. They suspected he was always thinking several moves ahead, the way a chess master calculates future positions before making the current move. His ambition didn't stop at ruling Corinth well. Sisyphus wanted more. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted his name to echo through history. He wanted to accomplish things that seemed impossible, things that would prove he operated on a different level than ordinary men. This drive pushed him to take risks that more cautious rulers would never consider. It made him bold. It also made him dangerous. One of the most famous stories about Sisyphus involves a river god named Asopus. Asopus had a daughter Aegina, and she disappeared. Asopus searched everywhere for her, desperate to find his child. Eventually, he learned that Zeus had taken her. The king of the gods had abducted his daughter. Asopus confronted Zeus, demanding her return. Zeus predictably refused. The god's desires superseded the concerns of a mere river deity. Sisyphus witnessed this encounter. He saw Asopus's grief and rage. He saw the powerlessness of even a god when facing Zeus's authority. And in that moment, Sisyphus made a calculation. He approached Asopus and offered him information. He told the river god that he knew where Aegina had been taken. He knew what had happened to her. In exchange, Asopus would provide Corinth with a fresh water spring, something the city desperately needed. The bargain was struck. Asopus got information about his daughter. Corinth got water. And Sisyphus got something more valuable than either of those things. He got leverage over Zeus himself. He had essentially informed on the king of the gods. He had revealed Zeus's secret. He had put himself in the position of knowing something that Zeus preferred to keep hidden. This action reveals everything about Sisyphus's character. He wasn't interested in simple obedience or respect for divine authority. He saw an opportunity to benefit himself and his city, and he took it without hesitation. He understood that information held power. He grasped that even the gods had vulnerabilities. He believed his own cleverness could navigate situations that would destroy ordinary men. But there's something else in this story too. Sisyphus wasn't cruel or evil. He wasn't trying to hurt Asopus. He was trying to help both the river god and his own city. His cleverness served practical purposes. He solved problems. He made things work. In the context of his own time in the world of ancient Corinth, these qualities made him admirable. They made him successful. They made him the kind of ruler people wanted leading their city. The problem, though, emerged from his confidence in his own abilities. Sisyphus began to believe that he could outsmart anyone, even the gods. He started to think that his intelligence and cunning could protect him from consequences that other mortals faced. This is where his character developed a dangerous edge. He didn't just respect power. He didn't just acknowledge that the gods held authority over humans. He began to believe that he personally might be different, that his exceptional mind might exempt him from the rules that bound ordinary people. This belief led him to take increasingly bold actions. He made decisions that pushed boundaries. He challenged assumptions about what mortals could do. He operated as though the normal rules didn't quite apply to him. And in doing so, he attracted attention from the gods. Not the kind of attention he wanted. The ancient Greeks understood something important about human nature that we sometimes forget. They knew that exceptional ability could become a liability, that the very qualities that made someone successful could also make them reckless. That confidence, when unchecked, transformed into hubris. And hubris, in the Greek worldview, invited divine punishment. The gods didn't tolerate mortals who forgot their place. They didn't accept challenges to their authority. They certainly didn't forgive those who thought themselves clever enough to outsmart divine will. Sisyphus had become too successful, too confident, too willing to bend rules and challenge assumptions. He had built a remarkable kingdom and proven himself an exceptional ruler. But in doing so, he had also made himself vulnerable. He had created the conditions for his own downfall. The gods were watching him. They were waiting for him to cross the line that couldn't be uncrossed. And Sisyphus, brilliant as he was, didn't fully understand that he was already walking toward that line. Everything changed the day Sisyphus decided to cheat death itself. Not metaphorically, literally. He looked at Thanatos, the god of death, and thought, I can outsmart this. I can find a way around it. And for a moment, impossibly, he succeeded. The story begins with Sisyphus growing old. He had ruled Corinth for decades. He had accumulated wealth, power, and influence. But he couldn't accumulate immortality. No matter how clever he was, no matter how much he controlled his kingdom, his body aged. His strength diminished. Death approached inevitably, the way it approaches everyone. For most people, this acceptance of mortality comes gradually. They make peace with it. They understand that death is simply part of existence. Sisyphus couldn't accept this. The man who had outsmarted river gods and manipulated situations to his advantage looked at death and saw only another problem to solve, another obstacle to overcome through cunning. Another challenge that his exceptional mind could navigate. When his time came, Thanatos arrived to claim him. Thanatos wasn't like other gods. He didn't thunder from the sky or appear in grand displays of power. He simply came quiet and inevitable to take mortals to the underworld. He represented the one force that no human could ultimately resist, the one certainty in an uncertain world. Kings and paupers, heroes and cowards, all eventually faced him, but Sisyphus had prepared. He had studied Thanatos. He had learned about the god's nature, his habits, his vulnerabilities. And when Thanatos arrived, Sisyphus didn't resist directly. Instead, he invited the god inside. He offered him hospitality. He showed Thanatos the chains he used to bind prisoners in Corinth. Magnificent chains forged by the finest craftsmen. Unbreakable chains. Chains that could hold even a god. Sisyphus asked Thanatos a simple question. Could these chains actually hold a god? Could they restrain divine power? Thanatos, curious or perhaps arrogant in his own way, allowed himself to be bound. Just to demonstrate that mortal chains couldn't hold him. Just to prove his superiority. Except they could, and they did. Sisyphus had trapped death itself. He had chained Thanatos and locked him away. Think about what this means. With death imprisoned, no one could die. The natural order of existence fractured. Mortals who should have passed on continued living. Bodies that should have decayed persisted. The boundary between life and death, one of the fundamental structures of the universe, collapsed. The consequences rippled through the cosmos immediately. Ares, the god of war, found that his battles no longer produced casualties. Warriors fought but didn't fall. Battlefields filled with wounded but not dead. The natural conclusion of conflict disappeared. Hades, the god of the underworld, discovered that his kingdom emptied. No new souls arrived. His realm, already a place of shadows and loss, became even more desolate. The dead who remained there had no company. The cycle that had sustained the underworld for eons broke. The gods convened. This wasn't merely an inconvenience. This represented a fundamental threat to cosmic order. The universe operated according to certain principles. Death came for everyone. That certainty allowed everything else to function. Without it, reality itself became unstable. The gods couldn't tolerate a mortal who had disrupted the basic structure of existence. Ares descended to Corinth himself. The god of war, brutal and direct, confronted Sisyphus. He demanded the release of Thanatos. Sisyphus, displaying the same audacity that had gotten him into this situation, refused. He had tasted something intoxicating. He had proven that a mortal could outmaneuver even the gods. He had demonstrated that intelligence and cunning could achieve what seemed impossible. He wasn't ready to surrender that power. Ares, accustomed to obedience, responded with force. He overpowered Sisyphus and freed Thanatos from his chains. Death returned to the world. The natural order reasserted itself. Mortals began dying again. The underworld filled with new arrivals. The universe stabilized. But Sisyphus had learned something crucial from this experience. He had learned that he could actually challenge the gods. He had learned that his mind could accomplish what brute strength couldn't. He had learned that the rules everyone else followed might not apply to him. And he couldn't unlearn these lessons. When his time came again, when Thanatos returned to claim him, Sisyphus was ready. He had prepared another scheme. This time he instructed his wife not to perform the proper burial rites for his body. He told her to leave him unburied, to deny him the ceremonies that allowed the dead to rest peacefully in the underworld. When Sisyphus arrived in Hades' realm, he went to the god himself and complained. He said his wife had dishonored him by refusing burial. He asked permission to return to the living world briefly, just long enough to scold her, and ensure the proper rites were performed. Hades, perhaps moved by this apparent concern for honor, perhaps simply not anticipating what would happen next, granted permission. Sisyphus returned to the world of the living, and then he simply didn't go back. He refused to return to the underworld. He stayed in Corinth, living among mortals, defying the gods' authority. He had now done something unprecedented. He had escaped death not once, but twice. He had outsmarted Thanatos. He had manipulated Hades himself. He had demonstrated that a mortal with sufficient cleverness could circumvent the fundamental rules of existence. He had proven that the gods' authority, while powerful, wasn't absolute, at least not against someone like him. The gods gathered again, and this time their decision came swiftly. Sisyphus had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He had challenged divine authority too directly. He had proven too dangerous to leave unpunished. He had shown that mortals given sufficient intelligence and cunning might actually be able to resist the gods. This couldn't stand. The cosmos required order. The gods required obedience. Sisyphus required a punishment so severe, so permanent, so inescapable that it would serve as a warning to any other mortal who might consider similar defiance. Zeus himself intervened. The king of the gods pronounced judgment. Sisyphus would be taken to the underworld. There he would receive a punishment designed specifically for him. A punishment that would exploit his greatest strength and turn it into his greatest torment. A punishment that would be eternal, unchanging, and utterly inescapable. A punishment that would demonstrate once and for all that mortals could not outsmart the gods. Sisyphus's fate had been sealed. His exceptional mind, his cunning, his confidence in his own abilities, all of it had led him to this moment. He had pushed too far. He had challenged too directly. He had forgotten, or perhaps never truly believed, that there were limits to what even the cleverest mortal could achieve. Now he would learn those limits in the most painful way imaginable. They came for him at dawn. Not Thanatos this time, but Hermes, the messenger god, accompanied by divine guards. Sisyphus stood in his palace, looking out over Corinth and the city he had built. The kingdom he had ruled, the life he had constructed through decades of cunning and ambition. He knew this view would be his last. He didn't resist. Resistance would have been pointless. And Sisyphus, for all his flaws, understood the limits of defiance when facing divine will. He allowed himself to be taken. The journey to the underworld began not with violence, but with inevitability. They descended through caves and passages that existed between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The light faded gradually, then completely. The air grew colder. The sounds of the living world disappeared entirely. The underworld that Sisyphus entered bore no resemblance to the world above. It existed in perpetual twilight, neither fully dark nor lit by any recognizable source. The landscape consisted of gray stone, vast plains of ash, and rivers that flowed with dark water. The river Styx separated the living from the dead. The river Acheron carried souls to their final destination. These waters didn't sparkle or flow with any vitality. They moved sluggishly, as though even water itself moved reluctantly in this place. Souls wandered the underworld in various states of existence. Some had been heroes and received better treatment. Others suffered specific punishments for specific crimes. Most simply existed in a kind of gray continuation of life, neither happy nor miserable, simply present in a diminished form. The underworld wasn't hell in the way later religions would conceive of it. It was simply the place where the dead went. It was final. It was permanent. It was utterly removed from everything that made life worth living. Hades himself received Sisyphus. The god of the underworld sat on a throne of dark stone, his queen Persephone beside him. Hades didn't rage or thunder. He simply stated the judgment that Zeus had pronounced. Sisyphus would receive a punishment unique in its design, crafted specifically to match the nature of his crime. He would push a boulder up a hill. The boulder would roll back down. He would push it up again. This would continue forever. There would be no rest, no conclusion, no escape. Sisyphus listened to these words, and something shifted inside him. He thought, "This is not a punishment I can escape. This is not a problem I can solve. This is not something my mind can navigate." For the first time in his life, he confronted something that his intelligence couldn't overcome. His cleverness, the quality that had defined him, that had made him exceptional, that had allowed him to manipulate situations and people, and even gods. None of it mattered here. The punishment wasn't designed to be escaped. It was designed to be endured. They brought him to the place of his punishment. A vast cavern deep within the underworld, illuminated by some sourceless light that revealed everything without providing any comfort. There stood a hill, not impossibly tall, but steep enough to require genuine effort to climb. And at the base of the hill lay the boulder. It was enormous. Sisyphus approached it and placed his hands against the stone. It felt cold and immovable. The surface bore no marks, no indication of how many times it had been pushed up and rolled back down. He knew somehow that this boulder had been waiting for him, that it had been created specifically for this purpose, that it existed only to be pushed up a hill and to roll back down again and again, forever. He thought, "I will push this boulder up the hill. It will roll back down. I will push it up again. This will never end. This will never change. This will never conclude. The realization settled over him like a weight heavier than the boulder itself. Not the weight of the physical task, but the weight of understanding that no amount of effort would ever produce a different outcome. No matter how hard he pushed, no matter how clever he became, no matter what strategy he devised, the result would always be the same: failure, repetition, futility. He began to push. The boulder resisted initially, then gradually moved. His muscles engaged. His body remembered how to exert force. The boulder rolled up the hill slowly, requiring constant effort. Sisyphus pushed with everything he had, and gradually the boulder moved higher. His legs burned. His arms ached. But he continued because there was nothing else to do. Then near the top, the boulder's momentum shifted. Gravity reasserted itself. The boulder rolled backward, faster and faster, until it crashed to the base of the hill with a sound that echoed through the cavern. Sisyphus stood at the top of the hill, breathing heavily, watching his work disappear in an instant. He descended the hill and returned to the boulder. He placed his hands against it again. He began to push. Up the hill. The same effort, the same struggle, the same inevitable result. The boulder rolled back down. Again and again and again. Sisyphus lost track of time. In the underworld, time moved differently than in the world above. Hours might pass, or years. There was no sun to mark days, no seasons to mark years. There was only the repetition. Push the boulder. Watch it roll down. Return to the base. Push again. He thought, how long will this continue? Forever came the answer, not from any external voice, but from his own understanding of the situation. Forever meant no end. Forever meant that death itself would be preferable to this, except that he was already dead. Forever meant that hope itself became a kind of torture, because there was nothing to hope for. Forever meant that the future held nothing but this. He thought, I will go mad. But he didn't go mad, at least not in the way he expected. Instead, something else happened. Despair settled into him like a permanent resident. Not the sharp, acute despair of a moment, but the deep, chronic despair that became the baseline of his existence. He continued pushing the boulder, not because he believed anything would change, but because stopping seemed worse than continuing. At least the pushing occupied his time. At least the physical effort distracted from the mental torment. Days blended into each other, or perhaps weeks, or months. Time lost meaning in the underworld. There was only the hill and the boulder and the endless cycle. Sisyphus pushed and the boulder rolled back down. He pushed and it rolled back down. He pushed and it rolled back down. The pattern became his entire world. The pattern became his entire existence. The pattern became in a strange way the only thing that remained constant in a life that had been stripped of everything else. He had wanted to be remembered. He had wanted to accomplish things that seemed impossible. He had wanted to prove that his mind could overcome any obstacle. Now he had his wish, though not in the way he had imagined. He would be remembered, but not for his achievements in Corinth. He would be remembered as the man who pushed a boulder up a hill forever, as the man whose punishment became so famous that his name would echo through history as a symbol of futility itself. The boulder didn't look like much when Sisyphus first approached it. Just a massive sphere of gray stone, perhaps twice the height of a man, sitting at the base of a slope that stretched upward into shadow. But when he placed his hands against it, when he tried to move it, even slightly, he understood its true nature. The boulder resisted with the weight of the entire earth behind it. It didn't want to move. It had never moved. It would never move willingly, yet it could move. That was the cruelest part of the design. The boulder wasn't immovable in an absolute sense. It could be pushed. With enough effort, with enough persistence, with enough of his body's strength applied at precisely the right angle, it would roll. This meant that Sisyphus couldn't simply give up. He couldn't accept defeat and lie down. The punishment required him to try. It required him to believe, at least for a moment, that he might succeed. He positioned himself against the stone and began to push. His legs braced against the ground. His shoulders pressed into the boulder. His entire body became an instrument of force. The stone moved, slowly, grudgingly, but it moved. An inch, a foot, a yard. Progress, however minimal, seemed possible. The hill rose before him, a slope of loose gray stone and ash. Not impossibly steep, but steep enough that the boulder's weight worked against him constantly. Gravity pulled downward. The boulder's mass resisted forward motion. Every step up the hill required him to overcome both forces simultaneously. His legs burned with the effort. His back screamed. His arms trembled from the sustained pressure. But he continued. The boulder rolled higher, 10 yards up the slope, 20 yards, 30. He could see the top of the hill now, though it remained distant. The boulder's momentum helped slightly as he pushed it higher, but the effort never diminished. His body protested with each movement. His muscles, even in death, remembered pain. Even in the underworld, exhaustion remained real. He thought, I can do this. I can push this boulder to the top. I can complete this task. Once I reach the summit, perhaps something will change. Perhaps the punishment will end. Perhaps the gods will see that I've learned my lesson and will release me. This hope, fragile and desperate, drove him forward. He pushed harder. The boulder climbed higher, 40 yards up the slope, 50. The top of the hill seemed almost within reach now. He could see the edge where the slope flattened. Just a little further, just a bit more effort. His body screamed in protest, but he ignored it. He focused entirely on the boulder, on pushing it higher, on reaching the summit. 55 yards, 58. So close now. He could almost touch the top of the hill. Almost. Just a few more pushes and the boulder would crest the summit. Then what? He didn't know. But something would change. Something had to change. He pushed with everything remaining in him. The boulder rolled higher. 59 yards. 60. The top of the hill approached. His hands pressed against the cold stone. His legs drove upward, his entire being focused on this single task. Reach the top. Complete the objective. Finish the punishment. And then at the very moment when success seemed inevitable, when the boulder appeared ready to crest the summit, the stone's momentum reversed. Gravity, which had been merely resisting, suddenly dominated. The boulder stopped moving upward. For a fraction of a moment it hung suspended, balanced between Sisyphus's effort and the earth's pull. Then it began to roll backward, slowly at first, then faster, then with tremendous speed. The boulder rolled down the slope, gathering momentum, crashing over the loose stone and ash. Sisyphus watched it descend, watched his effort evaporate, watched the summit he had nearly reached recede into distance. The boulder crashed to the base of the hill with a sound like thunder. He stood at the top of the slope, breathing heavily, staring down at the stone that now rested exactly where it had begun. His effort had accomplished nothing. His exhaustion had produced no result. The boulder remained at the base of the hill, waiting to be pushed again. He thought, this cannot be happening. This cannot be the entire punishment. Surely there must be something more. Surely the gods wouldn't design a punishment so utterly pointless. But even as these thoughts formed, he knew the truth. This was exactly the kind of punishment the gods would design. This was precisely what they intended. Pointlessness, futility, effort that produced nothing. He descended the hill. His legs trembled from exertion. His muscles ached in ways that seemed to deepen with each step downward. But he reached the base and placed his hands against the boulder again. He began to push. Up the slope, again. The second ascent felt harder than the first. Not because the boulder had grown heavier, but because he now knew what awaited him at the top. He now understood that reaching the summit meant nothing, that the boulder would roll back down, that his effort would be erased, that he would return to the base and begin again. Yet he continued pushing. The boulder rolled higher. His body moved through the motions of effort, though his mind had begun to fracture. Part of him pushed the boulder. Part of him watched himself pushing, observing the futility of the action. Part of him raged against the injustice of the situation. He thought, why am I doing this? Why continue when I know the outcome? Why exhaust myself for a result that will be undone? But he had no answer except that stopping seemed worse. At least pushing the boulder occupied his attention. At least the physical effort distracted from the mental torment of understanding his situation. 40 yards up. 50 yards. The top approached again, and again at the crucial moment the boulder reversed direction. Again it rolled back down. Again Sisyphus stood at the summit, watching his work disappear. He descended. He returned to the boulder. He began to push again. The cycle repeated. Push, climb, approach the summit, fail, descend, return, push again. His body adapted to the repetition in the way bodies do. The initial shock of exertion faded. His muscles stopped screaming quite so loudly, but something worse replaced the physical pain. A kind of numbness, a sense that he was becoming a machine designed solely to push a boulder up a hill. He thought, how many times will I do this? How many times will I push this boulder? The answer came immediately, forever, infinite times. An endless repetition that would continue long after his body forgot how to feel pain. Long after his mind forgot what it meant to hope. Long after he forgot who he had been before this punishment. Rage built inside him. Rage at the gods for designing this punishment. Rage at himself for the choices that had led him here. Rage at the boulder for its immovable weight. Rage at the hill for its endless slope. Rage at the entire situation for its perfect, terrible design. He pushed the boulder with angry force, as though violence could somehow change the outcome, as though fury could accomplish what effort could not. But the boulder rolled back down anyway. Rage changed nothing. Anger altered nothing. The punishment continued regardless of his emotional state. The boulder waited at the base of the hill, indifferent to his suffering. He thought, I will endure this. I will push this boulder. I will accept this punishment. I will survive it. But even as these thoughts formed, he didn't believe them. How could anyone endure forever? How could anyone accept the infinite repetition of futility? How could anyone survive when survival meant experiencing the same failure again and again, with no variation, no hope, no possibility of change? Yet he continued, because there was nothing else to do. Because stopping meant confronting the full weight of his situation. Because the physical act of pushing, however pointless, remained preferable to standing still and acknowledging the hopelessness of his existence. The boulder waited at the base of the hill. Sisyphus approached it. He placed his hands against the cold stone. He began to push. Up the slope, again. Time in the underworld moved differently than time in the world of the living. There were no seasons to mark the passage of years. No sun to rise and set. No natural rhythms that allowed a person to measure how long they had existed in a place. Sisyphus pushed the boulder and time became irrelevant. A day felt like a year felt like a moment. Centuries accumulated without his noticing, without any external marker to indicate their passage. But his body knew, his mind knew. Some part of him, buried deep beneath the repetition, understood that he had been doing this for an impossibly long time, that he had pushed the boulder thousands of times, tens of thousands, more times than he could count, more times than numbers could express. The knowledge didn't arrive as a sudden realization. It crept in gradually, like water seeping through cracks in stone, until one day he simply understood that he had lost track of how long he had been suffering. The physical exhaustion that had characterized the early days transformed into something else. His body no longer screamed in protest. It had adapted to the punishment in the way bodies adapt to chronic suffering. The pain became background noise, so constant that he barely noticed it anymore. But this adaptation brought no relief. Instead, it created a new kind of torment. His body had become a machine perfectly designed to push a boulder up a hill. There was no escape through physical collapse. His body would continue functioning, would continue pushing, would continue enduring for as long as the punishment lasted, which meant forever. He thought, I have been doing this for centuries. I will do this for centuries more. I will do this for eternity. The thought didn't arrive as a new realization. He had always known this intellectually. But knowing something intellectually and truly, understanding it in your bones, are different things. Understanding arrived slowly through accumulated experience, through the 10,000th push of the boulder, through the 100,000th, through the moment when he finally accepted that no amount of time would change his situation. Despair settled into him like a permanent resident. Not the acute despair of a moment, but a chronic despair that colored every thought, every action, every moment of existence. He pushed the boulder not because he believed anything would change, but because the alternative, refusing to push, lying down, and accepting defeat, seemed somehow worse. At least pushing occupied his time. At least the physical effort provided some structure to his existence. But the structure itself became a kind of torture. The repetition ground against his mind. Push the boulder. Watch it roll down. Descend the hill. Return to the base. Push again. The pattern never varied. The outcome never changed. His effort never produced anything except the temporary illusion of progress before the inevitable failure. He thought, why do I continue? What is the purpose of this effort? The answer came immediately. There is no purpose. There is no point. I push the boulder because I push the boulder. I continue because I continue. There is no reason beyond the repetition itself. The realization should have been paralyzing. Instead, it felt like a kind of clarity. He had spent his life searching for meaning, for purpose, for reasons to act. Now he understood that meaning was optional, that purpose could be invented or ignored, that he could continue existing without either. One day, or what passed for a day in the underworld, Sisyphus reached the base of the hill and simply stopped. He didn't place his hands against the boulder. He didn't begin to push. He simply stood there, looking at the stone, understanding with perfect clarity that he could refuse. He could lie down. He could stop pushing. The gods couldn't force him to continue. They could only ensure that he remained in the underworld, that he couldn't escape, that he remained trapped in this place forever. But they couldn't force him to push the boulder. He thought, I could stop. I could refuse to push. I could lie down on this gray stone and simply wait for whatever comes next. Perhaps nothing comes next. Perhaps I simply lie here conscious and aware for eternity. Perhaps that would be worse than pushing the boulder. Perhaps that would be better. I don't know. But I could choose it. I could choose to stop. The possibility of refusal intoxicated him. For the first time since arriving in the underworld, he felt something like power. Not the power to escape his punishment, but the power to choose how he experienced it. He could refuse. He could rebel. He could assert his will against the god's design. He stood at the base of the hill, staring at the boulder, contemplating this choice. His mind spiraled through the implications. If he refused to push, what would happen? Would the gods punish him further? Was further punishment even possible? Would he simply remain here, conscious and aware, for eternity? Would that be better or worse than the endless pushing? He thought, I don't know. I don't know if refusing would be better or worse. I only know that I'm tired. I'm tired of pushing. I'm tired of climbing. I'm tired of watching the boulder roll back down. I'm tired of descending and returning and beginning again. I'm tired of the repetition. I'm tired of the futility. I'm tired of existing in a place where nothing changes and nothing matters. But he also thought, if I refuse to push, then I'm giving up. I'm accepting defeat. I'm allowing the gods to break me completely. As long as I push the boulder, as long as I continue the effort, there's something in me that remains unbroken. There's something in me that continues to resist, even if the resistance is pointless. If I refuse to push, then I surrender completely. I become nothing but a broken thing lying on the ground. He stood there for what might have been hours or days or weeks. Time had no meaning. He simply stood paralyzed by the choice before him. Continue the futile effort or surrender to complete despair. Both options seemed equally terrible. Both options seemed equally inevitable. Finally, he approached the boulder. He placed his hands against the stone. He began to push. Not because he believed anything would change, not because he hoped for a different outcome, but because the alternative, lying down and accepting total defeat, seemed somehow worse. The pushing, however pointless, maintained some thread of his identity. It maintained some connection to the person he had been before the punishment. It maintained the illusion that he was still trying, still resisting, still refusing to be completely broken. But the pushing felt different now. It felt hollow. It felt like going through motions that had lost all meaning. He pushed the boulder up the hill, knowing with absolute certainty that it would roll back down. He climbed the slope, knowing that he would descend it again. He returned to the base, knowing that he would push again. The cycle continued, but something inside him had fractured. Some part of his will had broken. He thought, I am a machine. I am a thing that pushes a boulder. I am not a person anymore. I am not Sisyphus the king. I am not Sisyphus the clever one. I am not Sisyphus who outsmarted gods. I am only the pushing. I am only the effort. I am only the futility. The boulder rolled back down. He descended the hill. He returned to the base. He pushed again. Days accumulated into weeks. Weeks into months. Months into years. He lost count. He lost track. He lost the ability to distinguish between one push and the next. The repetition became so complete that he sometimes forgot he was pushing at all. His body moved through the motions while his mind retreated into some interior space where the repetition couldn't reach him. In that interior space, he contemplated the meaninglessness of his existence. He thought about Corinth, the city he had built. It had probably been destroyed or conquered or simply faded into history. His name might be remembered, but not as he would have wanted. Not as a great king or a clever ruler, but as a cautionary tale. as an example of what happens when mortals challenge the gods. He thought my life meant nothing. My achievements meant nothing. My cleverness meant nothing. I built a city and it's gone. I outsmarted gods and I'm here. I lived for decades and I'll spend eternity pushing a boulder. Everything I did, everything I accomplished, everything I was, it all led to this moment, to this repetition, to this meaninglessness. The despair that accompanied these thoughts was so complete, so total that it seemed to encompass his entire existence. He pushed the boulder not because he wanted to, but because his body continued functioning. His mind had surrendered. His will had broken. He was simply a mechanism repeating the same action forever, with no hope of change and no possibility of escape. This was the breaking point. This was the moment when Sisyphus truly understood the nature of his punishment. Not as a temporary trial that he might eventually overcome, but as the permanent structure of his existence. This was his life now. This was his reality. This was what forever meant. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no moment of sudden enlightenment, no divine revelation, no dramatic transformation. Instead, something small happened. Something so minor that Sisyphus almost missed it entirely. He was pushing the boulder, moving through the repetition with the mindless efficiency of someone who had performed the same action countless times when his attention caught on something unexpected. The texture of the stone beneath his hands. He had pushed this boulder thousands upon thousands of times. His hands had pressed against its surface more times than he could count. But he had never truly felt it. His mind had been elsewhere, focused on the effort, on the futility, on the despair of his situation. His hands had been merely instruments of pushing, nothing more. But in this moment, something changed. He became aware of the stone itself. It was rough in some places, smooth in others. The surface bore the marks of countless hands pressing against it. His hands. Over and over again, his hands had worn grooves into the stone. The boulder carried the record of his effort in its very surface. He ran his fingers across these grooves, feeling the slight depressions where his grip had worn away the harder outer layer. The stone had changed because of his pushing. His pushing had left a mark. He thought the boulder is different because of me. My effort has shaped this stone, not in the way I intended, not in the way that would lead to escape or freedom, but in a real way, in a physical way. The stone remembers my hands. The realization should have been depressing. Instead, it created a strange kind of interest. He continued pushing the boulder up the hill, but now he paid attention to the sensation of his hands against the stone. He noticed how the grooves fit his palms, how his fingers found the worn places where they had gripped countless times before, how his body and the boulder had adapted to each other through repetition. As he climbed the slope, he became aware of his muscles in a new way, not as sources of pain or exhaustion, but as instruments of remarkable capability. His legs drove upward against gravity. His back remained stable despite the weight pressing down. His arms maintained pressure against the stone, even as fatigue accumulated. His body was performing an extraordinary feat, not in the sense of accomplishing something new or impressive, but in the sense of continuing to function despite centuries of repetition. He thought, my body is strong. My body is capable. My body continues to work even after all this time. There is something remarkable in that, something worthy of attention. The boulder rolled back down the hill. He descended, but now he moved with awareness rather than mere habit. He felt his legs adjusting to the slope. He felt his feet finding purchase on the loose stone. He felt his body responding to the demands of the terrain. The descent which he had performed countless times became something he actually experienced, rather than simply endured. When he reached the base of the hill, instead of immediately beginning to push again, he paused. He looked at the boulder. He looked at the hill. He looked at the space around him. The gray stone, the sourceless light, the endless cavern that contained his punishment. And he thought, this is my reality. This is where I exist. This is what my life is. The thought which would have brought despair moments before now brought something different. A kind of acceptance. Not the acceptance of defeat, but the acceptance of fact. He could not escape this place. He could not change his punishment. He could not undo the choices that had led him here. These things were simply true. They were the structure within which his existence occurred. But within that structure, within those constraints, he had choices. He could push the boulder with rage and desperation, fighting against the futility of the action. Or he could push it with attention and presence. He could experience the pushing as a burden. Or he could experience it as something else entirely. He thought, I cannot change what I must do, but I can change how I do it. I cannot escape this punishment, but I can change my relationship to it. He approached the boulder and placed his hands against the stone. This time, instead of simply pushing, he paid attention to the action itself. He felt the pressure building in his legs as he drove upward. He felt the stone pressing back against his hands. He felt the slight give as the boulder began to move. He felt the rhythm of the effort, the moment of greatest strain, the moment of momentum, the moment of adjustment. The boulder rolled up the slope. He climbed behind it, maintaining contact with the stone, feeling every moment of the ascent. The effort remained real. The difficulty remained genuine. But his experience of it had changed. He was no longer simply enduring the pushing. He was actually pushing. He was present in the action rather than mentally removed from it. 40 yards up the slope. 50 yards. The summit approached. And as it approached, he thought, the boulder will roll back down. I know this. I have known this for centuries. And that's fine. That's acceptable. The rolling back down doesn't negate the pushing up. The failure doesn't erase the effort. Each push is real, regardless of what comes after. The boulder reached the summit. For a moment it balanced at the top of the hill. And then, as always, it rolled back down. But this time, Sisyphus didn't experience the rolling as a negation of his effort. He experienced it as part of the cycle. The pushing up and the rolling down were both part of the same action. They weren't separate events. They were components of a single continuous process. He descended the hill and returned to the boulder. He placed his hands against the stone. He began to push again. But something fundamental had changed. The pushing no longer felt like punishment. It felt like work, real work. Work that required effort and attention and presence. Work that his body could perform. Work that, while repetitive, contained within it a kind of integrity. He thought, I push the boulder. That is what I do. That is my work. That is my life. And there is something in that. There is something real in the doing of it. Days passed, or weeks, or months. Time remained irrelevant. But his experience of the repetition continued to shift. He began to notice variations within the apparent sameness. Some days the boulder seemed slightly easier to move. Other days it resisted more. The slope sometimes felt steeper, sometimes less so. The light in the cavern seemed to shift in subtle ways. None of these variations changed the fundamental structure of his punishment. The boulder still rolled back down. The cycle still continued. But the variations meant that each push was slightly different from the last. He began to take pride in the pushing. Not pride in accomplishing something, but pride in doing the work well. He learned the precise angle at which to position himself for maximum efficiency. He learned how to distribute his effort to minimize strain. He learned to move with the boulder rather than against it. He learned the rhythm of the work and moved in harmony with that rhythm. He thought, I am becoming skilled at this. I am becoming good at pushing a boulder up a hill. This is not the skill I imagined developing. This is not the achievement I sought, but it is real. And there is something worthy in developing skill, in becoming proficient in doing something well, regardless of the external outcome. The transformation wasn't complete. Despair still visited him sometimes. The futility of the action still struck him occasionally. But these moments no longer defined his entire existence. They came and went like clouds passing across the sky. Beneath them, something else had emerged. Something quieter, something more stable, something that might impossibly be called acceptance. Sisyphus continued to push the boulder. The boulder continued to roll back down. The cycle continued, but he had changed. He had moved from fighting against his punishment to living within it. He had moved from despair to something that resembled, if not quite happiness, then at least a kind of peace. Weeks turned into months. Months accumulated into years. Sisyphus continued pushing the boulder, but the experience had transformed completely. The repetition, which had once felt like torture, began to feel like something else entirely. Something closer to meditation. A state of being where his mind could settle into a kind of stillness, while his body performed its familiar work. The pushing required just enough attention to keep him present without demanding so much that it created stress. His hands knew where to grip. His legs knew how to drive. His back knew how to brace. The knowledge lived in his muscles, now accumulated through centuries of repetition. This allowed his conscious mind to rest, to simply observe, to exist in the moment without constantly fighting against it. He thought, this is what meditation must be like. The body doing its work while the mind becomes quiet. The action continuing without resistance. The effort flowing naturally rather than being forced. As his mind quieted, he began to notice things he had overlooked during the years of despair. The light in the cavern, which he had always perceived as sourceless and uniform, actually contained subtle variations. It seemed slightly brighter near the summit of the hill, slightly dimmer near the base. These variations were minor, barely perceptible, but they existed. They provided a kind of rhythm to the space, a gentle pulsing that matched in some strange way the rhythm of his work. He began to notice the stone itself more carefully. The boulder bore the marks of his hands, yes, but it also contained its own character. Veins of darker stone ran through the lighter gray. Small crystals caught the light in certain ways. The surface had weathered unevenly, creating subtle topography. He had pushed this boulder countless times, but he had never truly seen it. Now he saw it. He saw its particular beauty, the beauty that came not from perfection, but from the marks of time and use. The hill, too, revealed itself to him in new ways. The slope wasn't uniform. Certain sections of stone were smoother, worn by his feet. Other sections remained rough, untouched by his passage. The loose ash and stone that covered the slope created patterns. Wind, or something like wind in this place, without weather, moved the particles, creating small dunes and ridges. These patterns changed constantly, never the same, twice, yet always following the same principles. Order emerging from apparent chaos. He thought, there is beauty here. In this place I thought was only gray and empty. There is actual beauty. I just had to stop fighting long enough to see it. His relationship to his own body changed as well. For centuries he had experienced his body as a source of pain and limitation. as something that tired and ached and resisted his will. But now he began to appreciate what his body could do. The strength that allowed him to move a massive boulder. The endurance that allowed him to continue for centuries without breaking. The coordination that allowed him to navigate the slope without falling. The resilience that allowed him to continue functioning despite the repetition. He thought, my body is remarkable. It has carried me through centuries of this work. It continues to function. It continues to grow stronger. There is something worthy of respect in that. Something worthy of gratitude. He began to approach the pushing with a kind of reverence. Not reverence toward the punishment or the gods who had imposed it, but reverence toward the work itself, toward the act of pushing, toward the meeting between his effort and the boulder's resistance. He moved with intention. He paid attention to the precise positioning of his hands. He felt the power flowing through his legs. He maintained awareness of his breathing and his balance. The boulder responded to this tension, not in the sense that it became easier to push or that it failed to roll back down, but in the sense that the pushing became more efficient, more elegant, more in harmony with natural forces at work. He learned to work with gravity rather than against it. He learned to position the boulder so that his effort aligned with the slope's angle. He learned to move in ways that conserved energy while maximizing effect. He thought, I am becoming a master of this work, not because I have escaped it or overcome it, but because I have fully committed to it. I have stopped resisting and started participating. And in that participation, I have found something like mastery. The pushing became something he looked forward to, not in the way he had once looked forward to ruling Corinth or accomplishing great deeds, but in a quieter way, the way a craftsman looks forward to working with their tools, the way a musician looks forward to playing their instrument. The work itself became the reward. The doing became the point. He began to create small variations in his approach, not to escape the punishment, but to explore different ways of doing the work. He experimented with different hand positions, different paces, different rhythms. Each variation produced slightly different results. Some approaches felt more natural than others. Some created a better flow. Through this exploration, he developed a kind of personal style, a way of pushing the boulder that was uniquely his. He thought, I am creating something, not in the sense of building something that persists, but in the sense of creating a way of being, a way of moving through this space, a way of engaging with this work. This creation is mine. The gods cannot take it from me. It exists in how I do what I do. The acceptance that had begun to emerge in the previous phase deepened into something more profound. He no longer merely accepted his punishment as an unchangeable fact. He had begun to embrace it, not because the punishment was good or just, but because it was his, because it had shaped him, because within its constraints he had discovered something valuable. He thought, this punishment made me into something I could not have become otherwise. It stripped away everything I thought mattered. It forced me to confront meaninglessness. And in that confrontation, I discovered that meaning isn't something given to you. It's something you create through how you choose to live, through how you choose to engage with what you're given. One day, or what passed for a day in the underworld, Sisyphus reached the summit of the hill and paused before the boulder rolled back down. He stood there looking out over the cavern, feeling the stone beneath his feet, aware of his own body and its strength. And he felt something that he hadn't felt since arriving in the underworld. He felt something approaching happiness, not happiness in the sense of joy or pleasure, but happiness in the sense of rightness. of being exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do, of having found a purpose not in the destination, but in the journey itself, of having discovered that the repetition he had once despised contained within it an infinite depth. He thought, I am happy, not because my circumstances have changed. They haven't. The boulder still rolls back down. I still must push it again. I will still do this forever. But I am happy because I have stopped waiting for my circumstances to change. I have stopped believing that happiness requires escape or victory or achievement. I have discovered that happiness can exist right here in this moment, doing this work, being fully present in my own life. The boulder rolled back down the hill. Sisyphus descended calmly, without urgency, without despair. He reached the base and placed his hands against the stone. He began to push. And as he pushed, he moved in perfect harmony with the work. His body and the boulder and the hill and the cavern all seemed to move together as a single unified action. He had not escaped his punishment. He had not overcome it. He had not defeated the gods or changed his fate. But he had done something perhaps more profound. He had transcended the punishment by accepting it completely. He had found freedom, not through escape, but through full engagement with what could not be escaped. He had discovered that meaning could be created anywhere, even in the most repetitive and seemingly pointless circumstances. The pushing continued. The boulder rolled back down. The cycle persisted. But Sisyphus had changed. He had become someone who could find peace in the repetition, someone who could create beauty from constraint, someone who could discover freedom in the very thing designed to imprison him. Sisyphus's transformation teaches us something that modern life desperately needs to hear. We live in a culture obsessed with destinations. We're told to work toward goals, to achieve milestones, to reach the summit. We measure our lives by accomplishments. We define success by arrival. But Sisyphus discovered something that contradicts this entire framework. He discovered that the destination doesn't matter nearly as much as we think it does. Think about your own life for a moment. How much of it do you spend working toward something, a promotion, a degree, a relationship, a house, financial security? We tell ourselves that once we achieve these things, we'll finally be happy. Once we reach the summit, everything will be different. But Sisyphus learned that the summit never comes. Or rather, it comes and goes and nothing fundamentally changes. The boulder rolls back down, the cycle continues. The destination we've been chasing reveals itself as just another point in an endless journey. This isn't a pessimistic observation. It's actually liberating. Because if the destination doesn't ultimately matter, then what does? The answer is the journey itself, the actual experience of living, the moment-to-moment engagement with what you're doing right now. Modern life often feels exactly like pushing a boulder up a hill. You wake up, you go to work, you perform tasks that feel repetitive and endless. You come home, you sleep, you do it again. The tasks don't accumulate toward anything meaningful. The effort doesn't produce lasting results. Tomorrow you'll wake up and do essentially the same things. Next week will resemble this week. Next year will resemble this year. The repetition can feel suffocating. It can feel pointless. But what if the repetition itself is where meaning lives? What if the point isn't to escape the repetition, but to fully inhabit it? Consider someone who works a job they don't particularly love. They might spend years waiting for retirement, believing that real life will begin once they stop working. They push the boulder of their career, dreaming of the day when they can finally stop pushing. But retirement comes, and they discover that life doesn't suddenly become meaningful. They've spent decades waiting for a destination that, when reached, turns out to be just another place. Sisyphus learned to stop waiting. He learned to find meaning in the pushing itself, not in some abstract sense, but in concrete, tangible ways. In the skill he developed, in the attention he brought to his work, in the small variations he created within the repetition, in the beauty he discovered in the stone and the light, and his own body's capability. This is what acceptance actually means. It doesn't mean giving up or surrendering to despair. It means stopping the internal resistance. It means ceasing to fight against what cannot be changed. It means redirecting the energy you've been spending on wishing things were different toward actually engaging with what is. When you stop fighting your circumstances, something remarkable happens. You become free. Not free in the sense of escaping your situation, but free in the sense of being fully present within it. Free to notice things you've overlooked. Free to develop skill and mastery. Free to create meaning through how you choose to engage with your work. This applies to almost everything in modern life. Relationships contain repetition. You have the same conversations. You perform the same rituals. You navigate the same patterns. But within that repetition, you can discover depth. You can develop intimacy. You can create something meaningful through sustained attention and care. Parenting involves endless repetition. Feeding children, helping with homework, driving to activities, settling disputes. The tasks repeat endlessly, and they never feel finished. But within that repetition, you're shaping another human being. You're creating memories. You're building a relationship that will last a lifetime. The meaning isn't in reaching some final destination where parenting is complete. The meaning is in the daily engagement with the work itself. Even mundane tasks contain this possibility. Cooking a meal, cleaning your home, exercising. These activities repeat constantly. They never stay done. But they can become meditative. They can become opportunities for presence and attention. They can become ways of caring for yourself and others. The meaning emerges not from the task itself, but from how you approach it. Sisyphus teaches us that we don't need to escape our circumstances to find happiness. We don't need to reach some distant summit to discover that life is worth living. We need to stop waiting for our real life to begin and recognize that our real life is happening right now. In this moment, in this task, in this repetition, the boulder will roll back down. That's certain. Your circumstances won't fundamentally change. Your life will continue to contain repetition and difficulty and struggle. But you can change how you meet those circumstances. You can bring presence instead of resistance. You can develop skill instead of merely enduring. You can create meaning instead of waiting for it to be handed to you. This is the freedom that acceptance offers. Not freedom from your circumstances, but freedom within them. Not escape from the boulder, but mastery in pushing it. Not a different life, but a different way of living the life you actually have. What makes life meaningful? The ancient Greeks asked this question constantly, and Sisyphus' story offers an answer that might surprise you. It's not achievement. He achieved nothing. It's not happiness in the conventional sense. He suffered tremendously. It's not purpose handed down from above. The gods gave him only punishment. Instead, meaning emerges from how you engage with your existence, from the choices you make within constraints you didn't choose. Different people discover meaning in radically different places. A parent finds it in raising children. A craftsperson finds it in mastering their skill. A teacher finds it in helping students learn. A caregiver finds it in tending to someone they love. A musician finds it in creating beauty. A friend finds it in loyalty and presence. None of these people necessarily achieved some grand goal. They simply committed fully to what they were doing. They brought attention and care to the work. They created meaning through engagement rather than waiting for meaning to arrive. The crucial insight is this: meaning isn't something you discover like treasure buried in the ground. It's something you create through how you choose to live, through the attention you bring, through the care you invest, through your willingness to be fully present in your own life, even when that life contains repetition and difficulty. Sisyphus couldn't change his circumstances. Neither can you entirely. You can't escape work or responsibility or struggle. You can't avoid repetition or difficulty or loss. But you can change your relationship to these things. You can stop waiting for your real life to begin and recognize that your real life is happening right now, in this moment, in this conversation, in this quiet space before sleep. Your struggles aren't meaningless. Your repetitive tasks aren't wasted time. Your daily challenges aren't obstacles to overcome before life begins. They're where life actually happens. They're the raw material from which you create meaning. They're the boulder you push, and in the pushing you discover who you are and what you're capable of becoming. As you lie there now, as your eyes grow heavy, I want you to hold on to something. Hold on to the idea that your effort matters. Not because it produces some final result that justifies everything, but because the effort itself contains value. Because showing up day after day and doing your work with presence and intention, that's what life actually is. That's what makes you human. You're pushing your own boulder. Maybe it's work that feels endless. Maybe it's relationships that require constant attention. Maybe it's simply the effort of getting through each day. And yes, the boulder will roll back down. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. The cycle will continue. But you can meet it differently now. You can push with presence instead of desperation. You can find beauty in the repetition instead of only seeing futility. Sisyphus learned to be happy while pushing his boulder, not because his circumstances changed, but because he changed. He stopped fighting what he couldn't change and started creating meaning within his constraints. He discovered that freedom doesn't require escape. It requires acceptance. Your life is your own boulder. Your daily struggles are your own hill. And somewhere in that, pushing somewhere in that repetition, meaning lives. Not waiting for you at the summit, but present in each step of the climb. Present in your effort. Present in your willingness to continue despite difficulty. Present in your choice to engage fully with your own existence. So rest now. You've earned it. You're doing the best you can with what you have. You're pushing your boulder with whatever strength remains. And that's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything. As you drift towards sleep, imagine Sisyphus at the base of his hill, placing his hands against the stone one more time. Not in desperation, but in acceptance. Not fighting the cycle, but moving with it. Finding peace, not in escape, but in presence. Finding freedom not in changing his circumstances, but in changing how he meets them. Your struggles are real. Your effort matters. Your life exactly as it is right now contains the possibility of meaning. Not someday. Not when circumstances improve. But now. In this moment. In this quiet darkness before sleep. Rest well. You're exactly where you need to be.